nice to see you all out here on a really terrible day. Like horrible, but it's about to become much better. So thank you for joining us tonight for Helina Metaferia's artist lecture. Helina is here as one of two artists in residence in critical race studies, which is a program that we started last year. So she's in our second group of fellows, where fellows come and they teach and they show their work. And in Helina's case, they organize close to a dozen events in her space, events that are bringing together a community, which is extraordinary. And she'll tell you more about her practice and how that figures in her practice. Helina is an interdisciplinary artist working in performance, video, installation, and collage. Her work examines the role of the body as object and subject in art, as well as its relationships to the politics of space. She's exhibited, performed, and screened her work at venues including the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Hamiltonian Gallery in DC. Her work has been supported by several artist residencies, including the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, Oxbow, Fountainhead, and Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. She completed her MFA in 2015 at Tufts University School of the Museum of Fine Arts and attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. And so you heard that list of long list that she's done, and I want you to think about the number of years in which she did those things. That's crazy. She should slow down. Maybe spend a year in East Lansing and hang out with us. She was a 2015 to 2017 ICAD teaching fellow in the new genres and MFA departments at the San Francisco Art Institute and has joined us here as artist in residence in critical race studies. The Artist Residency in Critical Race Studies is an initiative that has its home in the Department of Art History and Design, but is sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters and made possible through a generous donation from the MSU FCU, which, as I'm sure everyone in this building knows, is among the most important patrons of the arts in the area. We're really, really grateful to the credit union for its support of our program and to its support of the arts in general. So without further ado, Helina, please join us and tell us about your work.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that generous introduction, Corinne. Let's see. So I'm going to begin this talk with prefacing that I will be discussing my exhibition by way of revolution, but I want to start with giving you a little bit of background about my practice. So just to contextualize my practice, I am an interdisciplinary artist, and I work in collage, video, performance, installation, mixed media, basically anything that can help me understand or best contextualize the work that I'm interested in conveying. And with this, I'm actually focusing mostly on my Ethiopian American identity. I'm thinking a lot about place, I'm thinking about space, I'm thinking about belonging and who has access and who gets to belong in spaces. So I'll begin with talking about my series, Diasporic Hybridity. It's a performance series that I did from about 2015 to 2016. And this series was really looking at my Ethiopian American ancestry in particular and using performance and gesture as a way to talk about the feeling of in-between, being in between two places, two spaces, and also thinking about, how one constructs their own sense of self. simply an irrevocable condition. Home is simply condition. Home, condition. Home, condition. So for 3 hours, I wrote on the gallery wall and floor the James Baldwin quote, "Perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable condition." And I used charcoal and I smeared it with my whole body as a way to shift the text from becoming text into an inverted drawing of a home pointed towards myself. And I was thinking about home and belonging as something that's internal, that's one thing that you can sort of locate within the body itself. And I'm always impressed with the people that sit with me for 3 hours, because there was a dedicated audience of folk to watch durational performance. I'm actually more impressed with that than what I'm actually doing. So the next piece I'll show you is called Ancestral Honoring, which I did at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And Ancestral Honoring was looking at the archives. So a lot of my work deals with archives. In this case, I was dealing with the archives of my own family's personal history, family photographs, and maps of Washington, D.C. and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where my parents immigrated from. So the two capital cities, and sort of weaving that together. I dipped my feet in hibiscus juice and marked the canvas that was on the ground with my footprints, doing a different sort of walk for each of the ancestors that I could name and those that I couldn't name. And this piece was actually really special to me because I was working with my mother to help dig through the family photographs and the archives. A year later, she passed away, sadly, and so I did another version of this called Slow Dirt in commemoration of her. And that basically, she was an Ethiopian women's rights advocate and activist, and I dug through sand that I had constructed this installation, her memoir, a memoir she was in the middle of writing at the time of her death, which has since been published. And it was about her work with humanitarian issues, everything from ending child labor to, in Ethiopia, and child marriage, to issues around sexual abuse, etc. So that was kind of like a full circle moment for me from the other archives that I had been digging through to commemorate her. Similarly, that same year in 2016 at the National Portrait Gallery, Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., I performed alongside my mentor, my professor, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, an Afro-Cuban artist, and she gave me a solo in the middle of her presentation. I performed in the George Washington Room, the naturalization oath. Has anyone ever done that to become a U.S. citizen? I find it quite traumatic. I said that the oath that my parents took, that I would renounce my Ethiopian heritage to essentially become a U.S. citizen, and in that same breath, I'm gazing at George Washington, who owned slaves and who, at the time, black people were considered 3/5 of human beings. And so I thought about the irony in that sort of choice, but the reality, and that there's a new definition of what it is to be an African American in this day. In addition to ancestry, I've also worked with the idea of place in terms of gentrification, in terms of housing and housing politics. So in my solo exhibition at the Museum of African Diaspora in 2017, I presented work that had to do with the Bay Area housing crisis, linking it to other urban centers across the globe. And here's just a little overview of that. So I was interested in how one can create a performance-driven exhibition without having to perform every single day for 3 months of the exhibition. So I used a lot of relics. I used video, photography, drawing, installation, all the things that came out of performances for me. And I'll go through some of the elements of the exhibition. The central theme, or the central film, was called Sacred Transition, and it documents performances of myself and a collaborator in each and 4 of the major cities that I have lived and worked. And those cities being Washington, D.C., Harlem, and New York, and Oakland, California, where I was currently living at, or when I was living at the time, and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where my family is from. And in each performance, I did something improvisational. The structure was I had to do something like maybe 2 hours before sunset, so it could be just me thinking on my feet with a collaborator. And so in Harlem, we exchanged a scarf back and forth, myself and Autumn Knight, who was living in Harlem and still living in Harlem and working in Harlem. And sirens were blaring in the background, which you heard in the previous film, and it became a gesture of comfort. In Washington, D.C., I performed alongside Sadame Konnen, who is an Ethiopian American artist such as myself, and we performed in front of Zennaba Chinjera, which was a place that was being closed, a mom and pop shop where we would get our Ethiopian food. After 25 years of service, they were closed down. In what's known as more like Little Ethiopia corridor of DC on U Street. So we commemorated that. This happened the same week I was shooting was the week of the ghost ship fire, which I don't know if people are familiar with that. About 36 artists lost their lives in the Bay Area. And a lot of that came from housing politics. I mean, Bay Area is the most expensive region, right, in the whole country. And artists have been squatting in this space, and there was a party, devastatingly, people lost their lives. So the gesture that I did with my friend Aida Elia Rashid, who's from the Bay Area, is we joined the community in making an altar, a street altar, for those who lost their lives. And, it was really sobering. I was a teacher in the Bay Area. A lot of students were devastated. They had lost their friends. But it was this moment that became a part of the film, and I hope it raises some awareness as to what happens when there is not affordable housing. I'll show you just some quick video. I show a lot of video because it's time-based, so I think it makes sense. So here's a performance video that was in the exhibition. So I'll just cut through. This is from a series called Divination, where I'm using charcoal in some cases wooden flooring, and I'm thinking about traditional divination methods, the way to throw chicken bone or what have you, as a way to determine your fate, and instead replacing it with things that remind me of mapping. So I'm trying to map the unknown, mapping displacement or precariousness. And here's another video from that series. So it became a lot about sound, about formalism, thinking about painting and drawing history as well. So I'll skip through some of that. The installation of the wood was placed next to the video, the charcoal next to the video as well. And one thing I'll say about this exhibit is I found a jar from Benjamin Moore called Heritage Red, and I really love the idea that you can commodify and package heritage as a color and sell it. So I used it throughout the exhibition, and I still use it in my work. And the last video I'll show you from this series is it wouldn't be a performance exhibition without actual performance. So there was without live performance rather. So we did one performance during the opening, and I asked two of my students, my graduate students from the San Francisco Art Institute, to join me, as well as Ina Carlota, who is a Bay Area musician.
I'm filled with love to the brim.
Let's see if I can
And I don't let it go.
out.
So you can build your walls or your bands. Try to create more borders on top of borders. It's not enough. You just fueled me with some ammunition, and us with ammunition to fight and to love harder. Love is babies. Love is love is
sweet.
So much of that exhibition was about the sense of community and how community can help pull through in times of flux, and which is also a theme in By Way of Revolution. So the last exhibit that I will share before I go into the current one that's at Scene Metrospace is my solo show from the summer, August through September, Refiguring the Canon, which was at Hamiltonian Gallery in Washington, D.C. I must say it would have been really easy just to repurpose that and bring that here. But I had to do a whole new project, which is very much because I wanted to use the resources here. So this was mostly about, because I'm always looking at the body and sites. So the site was actually the site of art history and institutional spaces. I'm interested in institutional critique, but also who gets to access certain spaces, who gets to access certain histories, and who's represented in those histories. So the project came about because I was residency hopping, as Corinne alluded to, and I was at the Bemis, and there's a floor of materials that we could just pull from, and there were all these art news and art in Americas from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. So I looked in the 80s, because I'm an 80s baby, and I was like, who was making at that time, who was represented, rather. And I didn't see anybody that looked like me, black woman, not many people of color at all, not many women, but there was this interest in the primitive, this re-interest in what was considered inspiration for the modern painters, the Picassos and such. The primitive, unknown, unnamed artists. MoMA had done this retrospective called The Modern and the Primitive, and so I saw all those articles and I thought, I'm going to perform that on paper. So I collaged my performance stills with art from the 80s, essentially. I look at this as an extension of my performance work. They go really in tandem. The performances become documented, the documentation gets cut up and put into art again. And I'm just showing you just a few pieces. I made probably about 30 collages or more in the spring of last year. And I'm, throwing shade. I'm giving a little bit of side eye. I'm sort of seeing what I can do with the body and gesture and this material. So again, I love archives, and I love when I have an abundance of them for free. Also looking at the body and space, thinking, can I actually collage in time and space? Like, does that render in that way with photography as a medium? So I had permission from the estate of Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Saul LeWitt, as pictured here, Pollock, and used, got into different museums, Mass MoCA being one of them, where this was taken, and the National Gallery of Art, and used my body in conjunction with highly conceptual makers to see if I can change the conceptual nature of the work by just simply doing a simple gesture. Like, what's the most minimum thing that I can do to interfere in this and make it a political statement? And does my body all of a sudden make it about gender and race, the things that often artists of color are, critiqued heavily on? So that's, there's a whole series of this available on my website if you're ever interested. I'll just show you one quick clip from the series. This was a live performance that I did at the National Gallery of Art. This is a Congress-run federal museum, and I was born in DC, so I'm a DC-based artist, even though I'm very transient. And there's such a hierarchy in the DC art scene. Local artists is like, when it comes to like these big Smithsonians and federal institutions. So it's not just about gender and race, it's actually about, positionality too, emerging, So I laid for about an hour, and this was not an announced performance. I laid for about an hour in the middle of the courtyard at the National Gallery of Art in front of a Robert Motherwell piece. And I was interested in who cared. Not that many people stopped me or cared. Some people walked right over me. And that was made for great video work. And eventually I did get up. I thought that was super important to do. So the full video is about 10 minutes, and I'm just showing a bit of a highlight. Mostly it's people walking over me. So I'll get to the exhibition that's up. Hopefully people go see it. 2 blocks away at the Scene Metro Space Gallery. And it's up till March 29th. So I'll talk about the process, and I would love, Q&A is my favorite part, so we can get more into it then. So again, all new work, 6 months, and I was thinking, what resources does MSU have? And as this artist in residence of critical race theory, what can I do here that I can't do anywhere else? And lo and behold, there's a whole radicalism archive at the MSU library, which you all have access to, special collections. And that archive became really important for the development of this work. I was looking at revolution and what it even means, like how to define it, which I'm quickly learning means different things to different people. On the left, on the right, everybody wants change, but what does that change look like? So I actually really just started with a question, and most of my research is I don't really know anything and I'm trying to learn something, and at the end of the day, I might not learn everything. I can't, but it's about the process of unfolding an inquiry. So I have a very Pan-African perspective in a sense that I'm looking at Black revolution movements throughout the diaspora, what's happening in the US, what's happening in Colombia, what's happening in Haiti, what's happening on the continent. And I'm also not romanticizing, or I try not to romanticize movements of the past because everything has its flaws. I love this quote. If you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. Use your voices. So the exhibition is truly interdisciplinary, collage, video, installation. And I'm just going to go through bits and pieces of it. I will say that the reason that I was passionate about this, I always start with something personal and then it becomes more political. So, of course, I was, still grieving my mother's death, about 3 years, and she was very devoted to service and activism. And, I was, in a sense, reaching towards her, reaching back to reach forward and figure out how I can connect with her further. I was also kind of messed up and frustrated about where we are at politically as a country, as many of us are. And I was thinking, what did the people before us do, essentially? Like, how did they survive these times? So the exhibition has a central film where I gathered the descendants of revolutionaries. Frederick Douglass's descendants are seated on the left. Ashira Douglass is the child, and Melanie Douglass is her mother. Ayanna Gregory, who's Dick Gregory's daughter, and he's a famous comedian and activist. A lot of people don't know who these people are, so I have to preface it. So Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist, and Dick Gregory was a comedian and a civil rights leader. And that's her daughter centered. And then Paula Whaley, who is James Baldwin's sister, is on the right. And James Baldwin is an author and civil rights leader as well. And I want to show you an excerpt of this film. The full film is 17 minutes, so please go see it on your own time, but I can't talk about it as effectively as I can show you. So,
if we could take a moment and realize and think about all of the times that someone said something to us that carried us through. Wow. And then if we sit in that and accept our power to deliver the same thing. Yes. We would deliver it more honest. Don't think about how big it will be. Our families are who they are on the macro because of all the people around them that work on a micro. That's the only difference between my great-great-great-grandfather and anyone else is that his story got documented in a way that we can share it. Right. But we know how many people, stories were just as marvelous, or if not even more marvelous, that maybe weren't documented. But he could not have done who he was, and none of our family could do any part of who they were if any one of those people did not show up and think that what they did was important. Right. I'm not a murderer, but I'll kill before I die. I'll put a shotgun. I'm not a murderer, but I'll kill before I die. I'll put a shotgun. Would you talk about Master feed me good? Would you talk about Master do what he could? Would you talk about our works in the house, y'all? Would you talk about, what would you talk about? You better stop what you're screaming and you're shouting. It's hard to yell with the morale in your mouth, ain't it? You better find some moss on these trees. What you gonna run and tell? Who you gonna run and snitch? You won't make it to the very next clearing before the bullet in my gun will be whistling. I'll use your blood and your clothes to throw off the scent. Who you think you playing? Who you think you playing? Talking about you born a slave and you rap the die one. You move out my sight, I dig your grave, son. Write your name in the dirt, kiss you up to the sky. You're on my tracks, boy, you run or you die, cuz I'm not a murderer,
Okay, I'll let you see the rest. It was a moment, a really great day. It was all shot in a day. It was very conversational in nature. Again, I work a lot in improv. I just told them, come as you are, and just bring a song as a gift, or Milani was doing kind of a spoken word. She did a tribute. It was basically a tribute to Harriet Tubman. And, you know, I think, again, the idea that community sort of can heal tumultuous times is something that I really do feel strongly about. So that was basically, it's called The Call. It was basically a call to action, and it was meant to serve as sort of inspiration. The remaining aspects of the exhibition include collage, and these collages were based on Black Panther newspapers from the Radicalism collection that's here at MSU, South African apartheid movement posters. Thank you to my students who performed and did workshops with me, not just my students, but students from ARCA as well. I was invited to do a performance workshop with Sister Circle, which is a group run by ARCA. And those are the participants who ended up being a part of the collages. And so their faces are interwoven into the work. And I used some motifs in the scroll work from the Ethiopian arts traditions as well. I'm trying to draw in my own history with the American history that is here. I was referencing a lot of what's called healing scrolls, and those are very traditional practices where priests make these sort of scroll that's supposed to basically be visual medicine for a person. So I like that idea of like healing as sort of thing that you can embody through art. So here are some close-ups. There are quite a bit of detail in the headdresses. So there's a headdress series in which I am sort of adorning the women with affirmations and information is how I look at it. And then the details are in the eyes. The thing that's on them is coming through them, so fists and different forms. Here's some details for this one. Again, better to see it in person. And I'll say that most of these were made in January, so I work very fast. I can't wait to take more time with these and really I feel like I have years of stuff to work with. I mean, a lot of material, and at this point, I feel like this is the start of something that I want to keep developing and working with other bodies, taking the gaze off my own, and thinking about ultimately the we, the collective, as a force of empowerment, and that's essentially art as activism in a sense. A video is on display that highlights two of the students doing the gestures of standing, kneeling, and sitting, which is what we did in our performance workshops. And these are historic gestures that were used throughout history in different protests. And so we looked at that history and then embodied it. And so this is done with projection on top of the students. I asked the gallery goers, what is your everyday revolution? And thank you for those who've submitted. I have great note cards. How can you create or contribute to personal, social, and global change? And with that information, by submitting that, I'm turning those into these signs, basically these protest signs. And the installation grows over time so that throughout the 7 weeks, it's an evolving installation. I'm trying to get people to go back again, so see how it grows. And there's also buttons that were made out of these signs. And thank you to all the gallery attendants who did those great buttons. And last but certainly not least, in fact, my favorite part is the participatory, socially engaged aspect, where students and faculty-led programs. Yes, I have a lot of programming. I think there's I don't know how many programs, but I'm not running them all, yay. I've asked for collaboration in a sense, and I just really wanted people to come into the space, people who don't usually go into gallery spaces, who don't usually go into institutional spaces, to be able to participate ultimately. So I've invited several groups to do their own programming, and in exchange they get free space, and they get to use the resources of the exhibition. And all of that is available. I don't know if you can actually read any of this here, But all of that is available inside the brochure, the catalog, essentially the poster. And it includes, some of them are Black Lives Matter Michigan is coming in and doing a brunch on March 24th. I'll be doing a performance workshop. We have several wellness events. Black Student Union will do their monthly meeting there. Last Saturday we had the Black Book creation, the creators of the MSU Black Book, which is based on the historic Green Book, and they did a great panel. I'll also be doing a performance here at the MSU Broad on the 27th, which I'm excited about, of March, not February. And so the idea is that, again, I'm interested in access and bringing people into art spaces who usually aren't a part of those spaces traditionally. And also just wanting to make it a living exhibition. I look at social practice not as, or social engaged work, not as an afterthought, but integral into art making. And so often it's considered programming or this thing that's outside, and I'm really centralizing a lot of the exhibition around action and experiences, really. So I think you need bodies for that. And so it's, that is my goal with that intense programming. And what else? Buttons. I like the buttons. I don't know, but I'm sure we can go more into that, but I just want to exit out of this. I'm trying to see what my time is. I think I'm doing pretty good. I'm going to exit out of my speaking, get more into Q&A. But before I do, I want to just kind of look forward as to my next sort of project. So this is an ongoing project that I've been doing since 2016 called Middle Passage for Dreams. And it'll actually be exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit. OCAD, yes. And that's going to be July through August. So you can see more there, but I'll just show a little snippet. Again, my interest in storytelling and narrative and working collaboratively with others. So it's a 3-channel installation.
Home means anywhere I lay my head. Freedom means accessing the world from here, without any inhibitions, without any setbacks, without any restrictions, without any limitations.
That's why I go to escape from the world. It's like a nest. Place to regroup. So I could be a black man in America is to be more cognizant of the decisions you make, because self-expression is policed or by other black men, black women, other people's self-expression could end your life. Just naturally being you, seen as a threat. Your body is inherently political. It's inherently aggressive. It's inherently problematic. Being a black man in America is one of the dopest experiences any human being can have. The ability to see, to really see. Really see what
So it's about a 22-minute film total. And I shot it over all 4 seasons with 2 to 3 different participants in each season. The conversations range. I'm really interested in conversations as an art form. And they range from the abstract to the literal, talking about where we are at politically as much as talking about like something that doesn't even make much sense. So I'm interested in sort of playing with that, playing with the imagery. So I think that's it for me. Cool, thank you.
So my job is to help Helina take questions so she can think about the answers.
Okay.
So, yeah, go ahead.
In the magazines, I actually. Oh yeah, sure. Did I come across Carrie Mae Weems and who else? Lorna Simpson in the 80s. Yeah. Yeah. In little blurbs in the back. Sadly. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question, and I didn't mention that, but yes, and every time I did, I would be like, yes. It was not often. Little blurbs in the back, and I remember I was at the McDowell Colony collaging this work. I was living off residencies, still am, and I saw Faith's name in the back of like an art news, and I was like, oh, yay, she's here. And then I look up, and I'm like in her studio, her former studio, so I saw her name on a plaque, like in the 80s, and she was actually making in that time, so I felt energized. And I'm glad that there are artists like Howardina Pindell who are getting these great retrospectives who long overdue. Carrie Mae Weems, who was just at University of Michigan as well this past weekend. Phenomenal artists, and so obviously a lot has changed. I'm not saying it hasn't, but there's so much. This is all within like 10 years, really, the shifts that have happened, and there's so much more to do. And so that's kind of why I was looking towards the 80s, which isn't too far ago, but long enough where you're like, you have some distance. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Hi.
In your piece, your performance piece that you did in the National Gallery, two things. One, not that I would know, it doesn't seem like an hour is a long time. Maybe actually doing it seems like a long time. It was a long time. But is it possible that any of the other people in the gallery somehow were able to discern that you weren't just a random person laying on the floor? Like, did they see the video cameras perhaps? Or would a docent have perhaps let it sit down? Oh, she's performing that. So that the
Right.
responses weren't 100% just a natural response of the public, but that they would behave the way they do because they felt like, well, this must be.
Well, I didn't have permission totally. Like, I had permission of the education director, so it wasn't announced. So the only times people, I think, were clued in was when the camera was close. I had one cameraman, and when he went up to like the stairs to like the 3rd or 4th floor, there was more of like, are you okay, miss? Sometimes. The guard was clued in eventually, and this was actually an hour was long for me. It was actually one of the hardest performances that I did because my body was so vulnerable. It wasn't a position where I could really just get up, and there wasn't the protection of a space like this where people are clued in like there's an artist talking. So there was sort of a vulnerability there. Again, it's inside, not outside, and it's always more vulnerable on the street, I feel. But in a sense, it was hard to do. There's also a lot of politics with the federally run museum, such as the National Gallery. And that I started to feel it. The way the guards treated me was based on how they were treated. And there's been a lot of articles in the Washington Post about the guards being mistreated in that institution, and sort of the racial dynamics in that, like who's in more of a higher up positions. And I felt all of that in that hour. And I actually did site visits and other performances at that museum, so I was there for like 3 days. But it was intense, and you know, some of it was probably more like something to watch and see when there was a camera there. But as soon as the camera is invisible, it becomes a body on the ground. And then how do you react?
Consider doing it in other communities to see if there's a different response?
Oh yeah, I loved doing different things in different parts of the country or the world, and also different institutions. At Mass MoCA, I would say, and maybe I shouldn't talk about all the politics of museums in a museum, but there's definitely a support for emerging artists in a way that I felt like if I did that there, I probably would be quite different. And for performance art. Federally run institutions are a little bit more conservative. Yeah, so thank you.
Sure. And then Teresa.
I was, yeah. Oh, okay. So what would I have done if people interacted? I just wanted to see what would happen. It was like investigation. And I was working off improv, so it was a split moment decision as to what I will do. I try not to over-rehearse my performances, which makes people who are curating my performance work pretty upset with me. Because they're like, what are you gonna do? I'm like, I don't know yet. So it's still something that I'm working through, but I like to go off spontaneity. And I don't know what I would do. I think that that's based on the moment. And that's how I would leave it.
Teresa.
So when you're performing,
Yeah.
do you perform as yourself?
Mm.
Or do you embody a persona or channel some other external forces? Or is it some kind of combination of that?
So do I perform as myself is the question, or as, and thanks for asking that. Actually, that's a really good point because I'm always performing an aspect of myself, I think, as we all are. But I'm more interested in sort of characters, and sometimes I draw from oral stories of others. I'm always interested in like authenticity, right? So like, what does it mean to be authentic? So when I asked the performers at MSU, the students, to perform alongside me, I didn't ask them to be anything or do anything. I asked them to be themselves. And I think to me that's a political statement too. That's like a form of empowerment. So much of the time we have to code switch. So much of the time we have to change who we are to fit a circumstance or an environment or an institution. And maybe you don't have to do that. Like maybe that's not the answer. Maybe it's the answer is showing up as yourself, you know, and being, and owning it. And that's what I asked for Milani Douglas and, you know, all the other people who gathered in Baltimore on that day. And you know, Ayana's a singer, and she's like, so what are we doing? And I'm like, we're just showing up. We're just gonna do what we need to do, and it'll happen. I trust that it'll be good. So, thank you. Well, opportunities are great. So when people invite me to do things, it's like, okay, great. Well, what can we do together?
Do you have a set of dream spaces, however, that you'd like to perform in?
I think performing internationally for me has been more challenging because I don't know all the cultural norms. Like, and I have performed in Cuba and in Ethiopia, and I would like to do more of that. I think it would take more of me to sort of either educate myself quickly or in the moment. For example, when I was performing in Ethiopia, there's a whole thing around cameras. Like, people are really sensitive because it's a country where like National Geographic comes in and makes a lot of money off of people. So they just really don't like, not even selfies. I mean, this was in 2015 when I was performing there. Like, selfies is like, can you just not put me in that, you know? So coming from America, where selfies is like a norm, right? And, you know, there's selfie sticks and all these things. That was something I had to get around, because I felt like I was being disrespectful. Okay.
So the question is comparing these three works, talking about the presence of the body in the one finger and then the absence of the body in the other two.
Yeah, so this is all new work for me, and I'm still working through how and what I want to say, very publicly too. And for me, I wanted to definitely insert at least one full, almost life-size person into the space. I thought that scale would be really important. But I also feel like you don't have to say everything or do everything to get the impression of the body being there. So much of my work is about body-based practices, and then, you know, so much of the emphasis is just a hint of the body. It's not necessarily all of it given away, right? So I do make sort of editing, like when do I want to reveal everything, including the gesture, the stance, and when do I want to just sort of allude to the rest of the presence. And I like working directly on the wall. My goal was to blacken and brown up the space, and so we didn't paint the space, we just added color in other ways, and so that was for me really important. So I hope that answers your question.
Go ahead, Lily.
Hi. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Thank you. Yeah, so I have this healthy debate with friends that I hung out with a lot in grad school. Do you need the institution? You know, do you need the institution to even make these sort of statements? And general consensus from those who do institutional critique is you got to have the institutional access in order to make change in institutions. But I have a growing number of friends who feel like they don't. So I'm always kind of curious myself as to what is the line in which you can actually push institutional critique in an institution, like before you lose your funding. So that's something that I'm still kind of working through. But obviously this came from institutional support. There was grant funding to do a lot of the travel work that I've been doing. And so there are people curators and academics and people who want to see this kind of work being made. And so it's done really in partnership and collaboration is how I look at it. And the second part of the question is, how did the gathering in Baltimore happen? So I tell my students, like, relationships are super important, and always keep always keep them as best as you can. So I went to undergrad with Milani Douglas at not Michigan State, another MSU, Morgan State University. And we were friends, we kept in touch. And I was just kind of really thinking around this time last year, actually, like, what's my next project? What do I want to do? And I just called her up. I was like, I kind of have this idea. Do you want to participate? She's like, yeah, sure. And then I knew Ayanna roughly in DC, but not really. And so I asked a friend who knew her well, do you think Ayanna might want to do this? And she said yes. And then I couldn't find another person until like the fall. And so I really liked the numbers of 3s and 4s, like very small groups. And Milani knew Paula Whaley, and I asked her, and she said, I don't know. And I was like, oh, please. She's like, James Baldwin just he's big right now, again. He just had a film that came out last year. He has another film that's out now, Beale Street. He's passed away since like the 80s. But, all this stuff is coming out in his name. Children's book that just got released. And she's like, I'm done with it. I'm exhausted. I'm invited to speak to all these things. So she was like, just send me your work and let me think about it. And I sent her my work, including the piece where I'm smudging James Baldwin's words. She's like, I want to do it. And I felt so honored because it's like she trusted me. So it all came together really well and organically. And again, I try not to over micromanage how it goes because it's based on relationships and people and schedules. But I did fly out in October this year to do that in Baltimore. And Baltimore is significant because that port was the oldest slave port, I believe, in the country. And so that ritual was performance, my academic term, that performance was very powerful and needed. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
What do we think? All right, well, you can ask questions of Helina in person right now after we're done. So let's thank her very much for her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.